Hello, and welcome to the Barely Noticed podcast, a podcast focusing on queer history and the history of bear subculture. In this episode, we are here to discuss the AIDS crisis that occurred in San Francisco in the 80s and beyond, and we are joined with Ed Wolf to discuss his life and his personal experiences living through the 1980s AIDS crisis and his experience working in the hospitals and wards at around this time. We will be discussing the beginnings of the crisis, some of the sociological effects and responses that occurred, and the way the AIDS crisis impacted the queer communities in San Francisco and beyond. Ed Wolf is a counselor who has worked with gay men for many years. He has previously worked in hospitals, treating and caring for those living with AIDS, and he was featured in the 2011 documentary film We Are Here, a film on the AIDS crisis. Ed, thank you so much for joining with us today. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I figured before we get to any of the questions, maybe you could tell us, a bit about yourself, who you are, sort of what your
Yeah,
background is.
yes. Well, I'm a gay white man. I'm living in Portland, Oregon now. 4 years ago, I moved from San Francisco. I had lived there for 44 years, and as I grew older, it's San Francisco for me is not a city to grow old in. The We lived in a two-story apartment, and things are very difficult right now around housing and homelessness, and as in many countries in the United States. And uh, the streets started feeling mean to me. And since I'd been there so long and saw how much the city had changed, my husband and I decided let's try living somewhere else. So now we live in Portland, Oregon, and are part of a very large group of queer men called the Radical Fairies. And I'm glad that we moved. Uh, there's a number of people who of the fairies who are living with HIV, and so it's not like HIV isn't around us. It's
Mm.
just that with all of the successful treatment options, the impact that HIV has on the queer community is very different than it used to be, especially in the 80s and early 90s, when there just was nothing really that could be offered to people had AIDS at the time. And yeah, I'm the oldest of 10 children, and I'm a writer and a counselor and a storyteller and an organizer and an activist. And, my AIDS came along at a time in my life where I was trying to figure out what was I going to do with my life. As people, many people, if they're lucky, reach a point where they'll go, okay, why am I here? What am I doing? What's the purpose of my life? And AIDS came along, the epidemic came along, and it provided an answer to me. And so I got involved, and then I got really involved. I got involved as a volunteer, being like a buddy to someone with AIDS. And then I found out I had a lot of skills in that area. And after working with people on a volunteer basis for 3 years, there was an opening on the AIDS unit at San Francisco General Hospital. and I applied and I got the job. And so suddenly I wasn't just uh, being a counselor for one person. I was in a hospital unit with 20 beds. This is the first designated AIDS unit in the world. And so I was a staff counselor there and worked with many people, many uh, people with AIDS, many patients, many of their visitors every day. And I did that for a little over 3 years.
Mm.
It was a little bit like, feels now in retrospect, feels like going to graduate school, getting my doctorate in like how to be there for people in very, very difficult times. Like, like how can you be helpful to someone in crisis?
Mm.
And I've been asked that question so many times, and really the best answer I can come up with is the way to be most helpful and supportive to someone in crisis is to not try to help them, to not actually try to do something that you think could be helpful to this person, but to actually be able to be present and be able to get a sense of what do they need? What do they think?
Mm.
What do they feel about the issues being discussed? It's very simple in a way. It's just that it's not easy,
Mm.
right? Because when you're with someone who's troubled, your instinct is to try to want to take care of them.
Right.
And that is very well intentioned, but that's coming from you, not from them.
Mm.
Anyway, I'll be quiet now, but
Oh no,
so
no. No, that was more than fine. I suppose maybe we can start at the beginning, as it were. In the
yeah.
beginning of what were sort of the first signs of what we now call AIDS that
Yeah.
that you remember.
Well, the main thing that I remember is because I was living in San Francisco, there was the Castro district became a real important gay neighborhood, a mecca for many people. Lots of gay people moved into the area, and the Castro became this huge gay neighborhood. And there was a pharmacy, a drugstore right down in the heart of the Castro district. And I went to the movies actually once. There's a big movie theater there called the Castro Theater. And I went to the movies there. And back then, this was 1981, you could still smoke in movie theaters. And we were going to smoke some pot. And I realized I didn't have any papers. So I ran down to the pharmacy and I noticed in the windows there were these little Polaroid photos. You know, the photos you can take and they develop right immediately. There were photos that this young man had taken of himself. One was of his mouth. His mouth was wide open. And you could see these purple splotches on his mouth. And then one was of his chest, also with purple spots, and one was of his back of his legs. And you could tell like there was something on his skin and in his mouth. And underneath these photos, he wrote like, be careful. Hey guys, be careful. There's something, there's something going around in our community. Be careful. And I remember going in and buying the papers and um, rolling a couple joints, and we went in and smoked some pot. But all through the movie, I kept thinking about that. Wow, there might be something out there. There may be something about to happen. Ironically, I went to see the movie with someone that I worked with named Michael, and he had been complaining and concerned because he had a little purple spot in his eye that he went to several eye doctors, and finally he went to a doctor who took a biopsy and said, oh, you've got KS. And KS is one of the very earliest opportunistic illnesses that people with AIDS had back in the early 80s before there was the HIV test. So there I was in line with my friend Michael, getting ready to go into watch the movies, and he, he already had it.
Mm.
He had no idea.
Right.
None of us had any idea. So he was the first person with AIDS that I was really close to. And eventually he moved back to North Carolina, where he came from, and he died there. You know, I worked in an office with 7 other gay men. Michael was one of them. And by the time the epidemic began to wind down, all of them had died except myself and one other. People don't, it's hard to describe and appreciate what it was like in those early days to have so many people that you knew get ill and then pretty quickly die. And that's why I was lucky is not quite the right word, but I'm grateful
Mm.
that I was able to find a way to get involved. And I often say, for some of us back then, you volunteered, whether it was to like kind of be there emotionally for someone or provide practical support, help them do things. Um, it was a little bit like joining the army.
Mm.
Like you joined the HIV army. And of course, many of the other people involved at that time also had AIDS and or would get ill during the course of their volunteering. And
Right.
so I was grateful that I got involved when I did. And it led me, it changed my life in ways that I could never have imagined.
Mm. And if I may ask, since its beginning, was the spread of the disease, was it always associated rhetorically with men who have sex with men from the beginning, or was this made
No, it
later on?
evolved into that. I mean, certainly in San Francisco, what they were seeing was uh, gay men who were showing up with KS, the lesions on their skin, or pneumocystis, which was a very serious form of pneumonia. It was primarily gay men, but
Mm.
there were also, every once in a while, there were women or straight people coming in, and eventually they realized, oh, this was also showing up in the injection drug using community.
Mm.
And fairly early on, they were aware that HIV, when I took my first HIV related training in the summer of 83, they were already telling us, you don't get this casually. You don't get this easily. In fact, it's not all that easy to get it. It
Mm,
requires the exchange of bodily fluids with another person, either sexually or through the use of sharing injection equipment.
mm,
And so it was pretty clear early on. Transmission occurred sexually or blood to blood, that you couldn't get it informally. Of course, it took years and years and years for people to get that. But I was glad to be in the front lines early on where we were reassured you're not going to get HIV from a person who has it unless you share bodily fluids with them.
mm. I see. And do you remember when exactly the medical community began to take notice of this disease, and what were some of the early attempts like to treat the disease?
Well, the very first article that appeared in the JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, appeared in June of 1981, and it was describing these homosexuals who were showing up in doctors' offices in LA with this very rare form of skin cancer. And it was a disease that only usually showed up in much older people. And so that's the beginning of doctors identifying, in this case, KS, which are the purple lesions that the young man had photographed of himself.
Mm,
And, by the time the AIDS unit opened in San Francisco in 1983, there were already many people. They just didn't know it yet. There were many, many people who had AIDS. Back in before 1985, there wasn't a test yet. You
right.
couldn't test the way you can now. So the only way you would know if you had it was if you started getting sick. And by then it would be too late. There weren't any treatments. Um, the big medication that came out of those early years was a medication called AZT, but it was controversial because people weren't sure that it could work. People didn't know how strong the dosage should be.
Mm,
So it was very frightening back then to be told you had AIDS and there was nothing that you could do about it.
right.
And in fact, people forget, you know, it first started showing up in 1981, and then finally the successful treatments arrived in 95, which meant we went 14 years, 14 years without having really any successful treatments that could save people with AIDS.
Mm,
That is a long time. It's in the middle of that when ACT UP finally begins, 1987, because it's just so terrible what's happening, and the government doesn't seem to be, and in fact wasn't, taking it seriously. And ACT UP really turned up the heat on all kinds of activism, but especially around treatment research.
mm, right. And with respect to some of the early uh, treatments to treat what we now call AIDS, it was did the any of these treatments at the time have any drug reactions or sort of further aggravate the symptoms because of
Well,
course it
yeah,
was very
I mean,
provisional.
it was very hard to sort out what was the drug. Was the drug they were trying making people sicker? In some cases, yes. In some cases, was just having AIDS. It was a miserable. I don't know if people understand what HIV does, but it gets into the bloodstream and it duplicates itself. It's like an alien creature. It gets into the cells and then the cells duplicate the way our bodies does. And each time it duplicates, it recreates with HIV in the cell. So
Mm.
quickly it spreads throughout the body and it affects the very cells that make up our immune system. So it leaves the body completely open to any kind of illness that's in the environment. And
Mm.
in fact, most of us, well, in fact, all of us have certain bacterias in our bodies that our immune system keep at bay. But if your immune system was gone, these diseases would take over, which is what happened,
Mm. Right.
right? And so they tried all kinds of things. I mean, I knew people who were desperate. Uh, People were drinking their own urine to try to like kickstart their immune system because they had heard that that was possible. People were making all kinds of concoctions, herbs, and putting them into ice trays and
Mm.
freezing them. And people were, I knew people who had such terrible lesions on their face. They had heard that if you were able to get to the toner inside a Xerox machine, you could put some on the end of a Q-tip, put it on your face, and it could lighten people were desperate.
Right.
People were desperate to try to find something. And the virus was extremely resourceful. It constantly mutated. So just about the time, it's like the flu virus today. Each year that you have to come up with another vaccine because the virus keeps morphing and changing from year to year.
And if maybe we can shift topics to discussing sort of your own personal
Yeah.
experiences working in the hospital with those living with AIDS. What were your experiences working in the hospitals and the wards with patient or
Well,
with those
yes.
living with AIDS?
I mean, like I said, I began as a volunteer working with, you would take the training and then you'd be matched with someone who had been diagnosed with AIDS, and you would be with them until they died. And then you'd be matched with someone else and kind of be their buddy until they died. And then you'd be matched again. So I did that over and over. And then I started working in the hospital, which 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 was different because I wasn't going to see these people, mostly gay men. I wasn't going to see them for any length of time. I only worked with them in the hospital when people were in crisis. They were quite ill. They might have just found out that they had it. Um, and of course, when you found out that you had AIDS, one of the things that the people in the hospital, the staff, wanted to know was what kind of support did you have? Who are the people who can help you? Should you be contacting people? What about your parents? What about your friends? And there was so much, and there still is in many parts of the world, so much stigma about having AIDS and having HIV that it was very difficult for sometimes for patients to figure out who they were going to tell and how. How would they tell them? And this was one of the major issues that I and other counselors working at the hospital spent our time being with patients. Who do you want to contact? And how are you going to tell them?
Mm.
And there were many times when parents were notified and they would show up in San Francisco, come to the hospital, and within 5 minutes find out that their son was gay and that they were dying of AIDS. Like at the same time. And of course, you can imagine what a stressful and shocking interaction that would be.
Sure.
And, as we were talking about before the podcast, one of the things that myself and others did was spend a lot of time with people who were in shock. And so you have to find a way to be able to be helpful and supportive to people who are in shock. And that can be very challenging because usually people who are in shock aren't even going to remember much of what you say or do because
Mhm.
that's the nature of being in shock. You're at a loss. You're so upset. You can't believe it. And so being able to learn ways to be very calm, very present, not try to fix anything, not try to tell people everything's going to be okay, because I didn't know if things were going to be okay. It took me a while to find that place, but pretty soon I understood the importance of taking a couple breaths, standing outside a room, and then knocking on the door and going in and saying, "Hello, my name is Ed. I'm one of the counselors here today. How are you doing?" Over and over and over and over again. And each time I would find something different. And I had to learn how to not have any agenda about how I would have to be, how I was going to try to solve the problem. Because for many of these patients and their visitors, there wasn't a lot to solve. Their boy was gay and he was dying, and there wasn't much they could do about it.
Right.
It's terrible, just terrible. And I still can't believe, I'm writing a memoir about it and I'm reliving some of it. And I can't believe that as a young man, what I and thousands of other people did around the country and around the world, all of the thousands of people who stepped up, who tried to make a difference, was terrible and challenging.
Right.
The whole world just went through this the COVID pandemic. And one of the things there that I kept thinking about was that at least with HIV and AIDS, you could be with people, you could touch people,
Right.
you could be in the same room and ask them, "How are you doing?" You know, we couldn't do that with COVID. There
Right.
was still so much fear and anyway, I'm getting a little off track, but
No
but
worries.
but but certainly the COVID pandemic brought up a lot of issues for people living with AIDS and for people who had worked in the epidemic decades ago.
Sure, sure. And if I may then ask, with respect to some of the responses, what were to the AIDS crisis, what were some of the political or governmental responses that developed as a result of the AIDS crisis? Was there ever I know that one of the responses that was made was the sanctioning of quarantining off traditionally gay facilities, as it were, closing the bathhouses is one response.
Some, yes, in some places. In San Francisco, they did, but it was quite controversial because in other cities around San Francisco, the public health department realized, why would we shut down the very place where we could actually try to do some education and some information? So they closed the bathhouses in San Francisco, but in Berkeley and in San Jose, they were kept open. And posters were developed saying, don't forget, use a condom. One of the big ones was no glove, no love. And it showed hard, uh, a hard dick and someone putting a condom on it.
Mm,
So it was controversial, even within the community. Maybe we shouldn't be closing it. And the same thing around needle exchange. That's how needle exchange evolved, with activists actually going to where injection drug users were and trying to exchange clean needles for dirty needles. And
mm,
I mean, the activism that came up early on was so profound and powerful. Like the government wasn't going to take care of our own, so we're going to do it. We we are going to do needle exchange. We are going to do condom distribution. We are going to do Meals on Wheels. We are going to create programs where we could raise money to help housing. We are going to do this. We are going to do that because the government didn't care,
mm.
right? And
Right.
in the United States, when you think about the fact that basically people started becoming aware of HIV in 81, it wasn't until 1985 and the death of Rock Hudson, who was such a popular movie star of the time. He was a closeted gay man and had AIDS, and he died very quickly, um, and was a friend of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. It wasn't until he died that there was a huge, finally, some attention paid to what was happening. And the very first AIDS funding began to be um, legislated. So
Mm,
we went 4 years with basically nothing. And we had to do it ourselves. And many different cities around North America and in Europe started doing their own community programs.
mm.
And it's very, very powerful to see how activism got motivated.
Right. And maybe going a bit off of that internally, then, um, did the queer community sort of as a whole become more focused on counseling and caregiving because of
I
the
wouldn't
epidemic?
say I wouldn't say the community as a whole. I think to actually go through a training to learn some skills to become a volunteer counselor, it wasn't for everyone.
Sure.
You really, I've learned in my life that in general, and I'm sure you have too, there are certain people that you can go to with a problem.
Mm,
that feel more supportive to you than others, right? We
Mm,
all have inside us, we have what I call the fixer, the problem solver. So, say you come to me and said, "Oh God, it's the end of the school year and I'm really swamped with work and I'm tired and I don't know if I can get it all done." And I might be someone who said, "Well, you need to take a break and drink more coffee and try to get better sleep." And then you go, God, I wish I hadn't brought this up with you. And then you go to someone else who goes, "Wow, that sounds really hard. How are you going to get through this?" That's the person you want to go to with a problem.
right,
So it's like that. Being an emotional support person to someone with AIDS isn't for everyone. For some people, they were much better at like doing laundry or going shopping, which was also really important. Practical support. Some people were good at raising money. Some people were good at driving the van. But there were a number of people early on who were afraid of people with AIDS. And so it wasn't the community as a whole. Also, the community was sick and
mm,
dying itself,
right,
right?
right. And I know you mentioned earlier, ACT UP and the kind of activism that was developing at around this time. What were some of the specific responses that developed on account of activism? Did activism seek to challenge governmental responses to the epidemic?
Yes. Well, ACT UP, again, just to do the timeline. So 1981, the medical literature begins to say something is happening. 1983, people with uh, AIDS are like showing up at hospitals and organizations looking for help. There's nothing there for them yet. The first AIDS uh, ward opens in 1983. 1985, the HIV test finally is developed. So, for the first time, you can take a test and find out if you have HIV or not. And it's still 2 more years before ACT UP begins.
Mm,
And their focus initially was on trying to disrupt the normal day to day operations of the world and tell people, "Hey, this terrible disease is here. And people, we need to do something about it, especially around treatment." And, there's some wonderful documentaries that are out there that tell the story of ACT UP and how they would like go to churches and do die-ins and uh, chain themselves to the doorways of medical facilities and, you know, fight back, fight AIDS, fight back, fight AIDS. We are dying, do something, on and on and on. And many of those early ACT UP volunteers, activists were people with AIDS themselves.
mm,
They all died. And the same with the clinical trials. Many, many of the people who signed up in those clinical trials trying to find medications that will work were all people with AIDS,
right,
and most of them died. And I tell people, remind people all the time that the people who are living and are alive and well today with HIV owe a huge amount of gratitude to all of the people who died trying to find these medications that would work.
right,
Thousands and thousands of people. See, if HIV/AIDS wasn't so stigmatized and located in these two groups of into these different groups of people who aren't cared about: homosexuals, sex workers, injection drug users, promiscuous people. If this disease was like COVID, the story of what happened with HIV and AIDS and how people rose up to make a difference would be part of our natural world history.
Right.
Everyone would know the history the way I do. But because AIDS is so stigmatized, it's it gets lost in time, which is why I'm so grateful when people like you put together podcasts to try to bring that history from the past into the here and now,
Mm.
because it's a story that the mainstream just doesn't care about.
And on the subject of stigmatizing, during the AIDS crisis, did you ever recall any rhetorical scapegoating or placing the blame of the epidemic on sort of queer
Oh,
culture? Or...
oh, totally. I mean, the way you got HIV or AIDS was from someone who had it.
Hmm.
So a very broad stroke was, don't be hanging out with people who have it. And definitely don't be having sex with them. Don't share injection equipment with them. And for the general population, don't touch them. Don't share food with them. Don't drink from the same cups. I mean, the fear of contagion, even when it was clear that you couldn't get it from a cup or a plate or a handshake. It was years trying to um, educate people and reassure them that you can't get it that way.
Hmm.
Look at what we did, even I did around COVID just a couple years ago. You know, the word got out like you can get it from your mail. Don't open your mail right away. When you go to the grocery store, wash all your produce. If you get a box from Amazon, leave it for 4 days before you. I mean,
Right.
people were freaking out. And um, even I did for like 10 days. And then I went, okay, remember, this is how prevention works. When you don't know for sure, you tell people all this stuff that's not true.
Right. And
So,
in
yeah.
and in the long run, sort of as a broader sociological phenomenon, as you've experienced, did the epidemic contribute to fostering negative attitudes towards gay by men who have sex with men?
Oh, oh, God, yes. You're a slut. You're promiscuous. You're a drug addict. You don't care about yourself. You're irresponsible. You couldn't take a moment to put a condom on.
Mm.
You couldn't tell your partner before you had sex. I mean, here's the irony: condoms work. Condoms are effective. They actually can stop the transmission of HIV.
Mm.
Unfortunately, they're not easy to use. They're not easy, I should say, they're easy to use. They're not easy for people to integrate
Mm.
into their sex life. And they're not easy to try to talk your partner into using if they don't want to. But it is very poignant that we had from the beginning the tool that could have protected and saved so many lives. A little piece of latex.
Mm.
I mean, that is so poignant.
And when exactly did we start? I know that you said in the beginning this was over a sort of 14-year period before we found a medical solution, as it were, or not solution, a treatment for.
Yeah,
When did we start to see the decline in the number of cases of deaths as a
yeah.
result of AIDS?
Well, certainly the combination treatments started to appear in early 95, and by within 18 months, people who thought that they were dying were suddenly coming back to life. And it was clear that these medications weren't eradicating the virus, but they were stopping its ability to multiply. And so in some ways, it it kind of arrested the virus where it was at. And eventually, where people would have 20, 30, 40,000 uh, replicas of the virus in their body, after being on these treatments for a while, uh, it was impossible to find it anymore. They would still test positive to the antibodies for the virus, which means they still had it, but they didn't have it to the extent that they could transmit it. And of course, that changed everything because suddenly, whether you used a condom or not, didn't matter. And then very soon after that, medication from based on the same medication that they gave people with AIDS and HIV, they were able to develop medications to give to people who were uninfected, HIV negative people, to protect them. And
Right.
that's where we're at today. Everybody can take medication to protect them from either transmitting the virus or becoming infected with it.
Right.
So it's changed everything.
Mm. Right. And maybe if I can ask, what would you say are some of the long-term effects of the AIDS crisis as a whole?
Well, I think part of this is about what I was talking to you earlier about is that it would be like it would be like if World War II happened and no one knew about it. You know, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that something as big as World War II happened in the queer community. And many, many people either are not aware of it or, they know something happened.
Right.
And so sometimes when queer people are together and there are older people, middle-aged people, and younger people, it can be difficult to be together because I know for me, I am very comforted by being with people my age who went through it. I remind I remind myself of my father. After my father came home from Europe after World War II, all he really wanted to do was be with other soldiers who had been through it. And there is a comfort for me to be with other people who were through it, or to be with people who are living with HIV and understand the impact that it had on our community. And, there are a lot of younger people, queer people today, who feel like, oh, older gay men are privileged and um, not not aware of how much the community has changed, and of course, my perspective is you will never know all the wonderful people just like you who died so that the community could be as vibrant and healthy now, saying older gay men are privileged and
Mm.
don't don't understand what it's like to be young today, to be a young gay person. It's
Mm.
very poignant. And again, I think, well, this is why it's important to do things like this, to do podcasts, to go to events, to go to gathering. Have you ever been to a gathering yourself, Hunter?
Mm.
Yes.
Yes.
So you know what it's like to come to a gathering where there's a wide swath of different people and be able to get a sense of our own history.
Mm.
Here's the thing, after Stonewall was the beginning of the forming of the queer tribe in different places around the world. So we went from like 1971 to 1981. We had about 10 years to find each other.
Right.
Then the epidemic came and decimated the community. And so we're still in the process of trying to find each other again.
Right.
And what does it mean to be a community on the other side of World War II? It has meaning. It does have an impact, but you almost have to seek it out, and young people like you who watch documentaries, who read books, who are interested in what happened and who that whole early group was. You're part of the you're part of pulling the thread forward because some of the best of who we are came from that time when many of us stood up and tried to make a difference in the life and death of our brothers.
Ed, if I can ask maybe a closing question, are
Yeah,
there any specific resources you would recommend for those who'd want to learn more about the AIDS epidemic?
yes. Well, certainly there are a number of wonderful documentaries that can really give people a sense of what it was like. Certainly, we were here. Um, or can you make these available somehow? Good. So we were here by David Weissman. How to survive a plague, which is the story of ACTA. United in anger, also the story of ACTA. Common threads, which is one that's gotten lost in time, but it actually won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. And it tells the story of the quilt that was first began in San Francisco, where Cleve Jones had the idea of everybody making a giant quilt that would include the names and some of the stories of all the people who had died of AIDS. That's a wonderful documentary. There are also some wonderful books to read about that time. And the band played on by Randy Schultz. Let the Record Tell, which just came out last year by Sarah Schulman, the story of ACTA. At some point, I've got to finish my memoir and hopefully get it out into the world, which is just a firsthand account of my growing up through the 60s, being in New York in the 70s, the arrival of AIDS in San Francisco, how I and many people tried to find a way to get through it or not. I mean, so many people I know are dead and gone. I
Mm,
know many more people who are dead and gone than who are alive today.
mm,
So yeah, you have to look. Luckily for us, the internet is here. You just have to Google history of AIDS. Bam, there's a lot of it there. And I would say it's not all depressing. It's not just sad what happened to our community. It's not just terrible. It's also full of stories of resilience and heroism and activism and creativity and full of tools and suggestions about how to live through difficult times. There's a lot to pull through that could be helpful today as the world seems to be in and entering another really difficult time.
right. Well, Ed, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Totally. Thank you.